Hey there friends, and welcome to Anti-Static. Today I'm going to be showing you how to create this radial data display. Now this is going to be a pretty long tutorial. There's a lot of advanced stuff in here, but I'm going to try to keep it as short as possible. One more thing to note before we get started, I'm going to be using the Anti-Static toolbox. It is not required, but it's just going to be helpful in a few spots here. Alright, let's get started. Alright, so it would be really difficult for us to create any sort of radial design like this that has these kind of details by creating a bunch of curved graphics. And so instead what we're going to be doing is creating flat squared graphics and then curving them by using an effect called polar coordinates. So I'm just going to create a new adjustment layer here and go ahead and add polar coordinates. And then you just need to make sure that you change this to rect to polar. And then if you increase this number, you see what it's going to do. It's just going to curve this square around until it becomes a circle. And this is going to make it so much easier for us to create this radial display. But there are a couple of strange things about polar coordinates that you're going to have to work around. All right, a couple idiosyncrasies that you're going to have to fight against, and then a couple of things you just need to be aware of. So let me go ahead and just turn this all the way down again. And just to demonstrate this, I'm going to open up, I'm going to show this hidden edges layer. If I turn this on, you can see these edges that we have. Now if I turn this back up, you'll see what's happening. It's wrapping the square around, but you really need to pay attention to these edges, right? So what we can see is that what was the bottom of our comp down here has now become all around the outside. And the left and right edges have both been squashed together right at the top here in this line. And in fact, what was the top of our composition is now squashed right together in the middle. We've got this white circle. So what that means is the higher up in our composition our elements are, the more towards the center they're going to be. And the lower down, the more towards the outside they're going to be. All right, and the other thing to keep note of is that we used to have a bunch of squares here. If I just turn this off. And now you see when we turn on this polar coordinates, these are no longer squares. They've been stretched out quite a bit. Especially the farther out we get away from the center, the more stretched they become. So if we just created some charts and graphs and then put it in here underneath this polar coordinate adjustment layer, the outside edges are going to become really stretched and kind of weird looking, and it's not going to be great. So instead, what we're going to be doing is creating a series of compositions. You can think of them as rings that will be a part of our radial display. So let's create a new composition, and I'm going to make this 4,000 by 500. And I'm just going to add another layer here with another checkerboard. Make that a little bigger. So now if I bring that new composition in here, and let's put it underneath our adjustment layer, so it's going to be radialized. We'll turn this one off. So you see, just like we just saw, if we move this down, it's going to go more towards the outside of the circle. But as it's going farther down, it's being stretched more and more. And so what we're going to do is we're going to have to squash this in to get these back to be squares so that it should look right. All right, so if I duplicate out a couple of these layers, let's just say we're going to have 4 rings here, and I bring them in like this. And we're just going to have to play around with these scale settings. We'll unlink this connection. The ones at the top can be closer to 100. And then the farther down you go, the more you're going to have to squash these down in order to get them to be square again. Now, of course, that creates a big problem for us in that we've got a giant gap. So what we can do is just add another effect onto our ring called motion tile. And then if we just drag the output width out, it's going to repeat our pattern until it closes up again. Now you'll notice right at the top where our left and right sides of our composition are coming together, it's not perfectly aligned. And so if we play around with this scale setting, you can see it's just kind of opening up and closing that gap. And so what we can do is we have to really dial in this to just what we want it to be. So if we make this 22.7 and just a little bit more, just get it to close up perfectly. And so as we begin, we need to keep in mind that because of this polar coordinates, we're going to be squashing these compositions down and then stretching them back out again. And so what that means is we need to work at a size larger than what we're going to need because we're going to lose a lot of detail in that process. And so our final composition is going to be 1920 by 1080. So I'm going to make our radial composition now. We're going to create this, and we're going to make it 4000 by 4000. Call it radial. We've got a nice large comp that we can then scale down into our final as we need to. And we'll just go ahead and create an adjustment layer. Add the polar coordinates. Oh, I can't spell that to save my life. And make sure this is set to rectipolar. And now we are good to go. Ready to create our first ring. All right, so let's create a new composition. And we're going to make it 8000 by 500. A very short, wide composition. Let's add a new solid, and we're going to call this noise 1. And this is going to be 8000 by 200. All right, so we just have a short layer within our short comp. Let's turn on the grid. And then I'm going to add to this a turbulent noise effect. And make sure the type is set to block. Bump up the contrast. And then we're going to change the transform and so we can make this really wide, 1000 by 100. And then instead of evolving this one, what we're going to do is offset the turbulence. So I'm going to write an expression by Alt or Option clicking on this stopwatch here. And we're just going to put an open and close bracket, and inside that type value, open bracket 0, comma, value, open bracket 1. So that's just going to get us right back to where we started. There's no change because we're just reading the values that are input right here. But we want to add to this y value. So right in between these last two closing brackets, I'm just going to type plus time times 200. And then what that's going to do is just continually move the noise downward. So we get this constant motion. All right, now let's close that up and let's add another effect, colorama. And we go into the output cycle, and we're going to change this top red, double click on that, change it to black. And I'm also going to drop this opacity down to 0. All right, then I'll close that up. I'm going to add another effect, which is mosaic. And we're going to make this 200 by 5. And then one more on here. Let's add Venetian blinds. Set the transition and the width to 50. So we have these big blocky shapes. I'm going to duplicate this layer and bring that copy up to the top here. And on this bottom one, we're going to make a few adjustments. So we have a similar looking pattern that's a little bit different. First, I'm just going to duplicate this Venetian blinds effect and change the rotation direction on this one to 90 degrees. So now we have two different copies of Venetian blinds making this crisscross pattern. All right, and then let's just close some of these things up a little bit. Let's add another effect called CC ball action. So we can kind of turn these blocks into circles. And we might bump up this a little bit, and I'll probably take down the size some. Let's turn off that grid. Okay. All right, so let's see what this looks like in our radial comp. Let's go in here, and in our project, we're just going to grab our comp 2, which is going to be actually called ring 1. And we're going to drop that underneath our polar coordinates adjustment. And we can just drop this down a little bit, maybe. Just see what that looks like. Okay. All right, it's looking pretty cool, but we have some structure because of the noise that we put in here. But I want to add a little bit more so that it feels a little less organic. So we'll go back into our ring here, and I'm just going to create a new layer. Make sure this one is the comp size, and we'll call this grid. All right, then we will add a grid effect to that new solid. And make sure that the anchor point, we'll just put this to 0, 0. Move it all the way to the top left. And then change this to width and height sliders. And then we're going to make the width 200 and the height 500. So it's going to take up the full height of the comp. I'm going to make this border really fat at 100 pixels. And set the color to black. And then what we're doing is we're just masking out half of the shapes in the background. All right, I might take these two noise levels and just bump them over a pixel to get rid of that little slice there. All right, now I can take this grid. I'm going to duplicate this again, this layer. And we're going to change this one to white. And change the border to 4. Okay. So now what I'm going to do, I want to create some more subdivisions in this big block here. So I'm going to create a new composition. And it's going to be, I'll call it title block. And we'll make it 500 by 200. All right, now to save time, I've just gone ahead and created a few blocks of color, just solid block shapes with a black background. Now I'm going to go into my utilities of my anti-static toolbox, and I'm going to add a text variable here. And I'm going to type in here field, and then just put some random numbers and letters. Hit that button. I'll make this left aligned and put it over here. So now every few frames, this is going to generate another random combination. And then I want to create just a few animated bar graphs. So let me just double click on this shape layer. I'm going to set this to 200 by 20 and make it solid black. There's no stroke. All right, let's call this bar 1. And then in my shape contents, I want to open up the rectangle path and the transform. And if I just Option or Alt click on the anchor point of the transform and then drag the pick width up to the size. And then after that add divided by -2. It's going to move our box, but now it will be growing from the top left corner instead of the center. All right, so now I can just move this over a little bit over here maybe. And I'm just going to set a quick wiggle expression so that it will bounce back and forth. So we're going to set an expression on the size. And because this is a two-dimensional value, we have to do this just like we did our turbulent display. So I'm going to write open close bracket and then add value bracket 0, comma, value bracket 1. And then to our x value, I'm going to add a wiggle and make it, say, 2, comma, 50. Now, because this is a two-dimensional value, our wiggle is also going to be automatically a two-dimensional value. So after that closing parenthesis, you're just going to have to write it bracket 0, close bracket. And now it's going to bounce back and forth. And that might be a little bit much, so I'm just going to slide the scale of this down a little bit. It's still going to move. Okay. Let's add a Venetian blinds effect to that. And just put some stripes on it. All right, I'm going to duplicate that and just move that copy down a little bit. So now we have 2 of them that are going to be operating independently. All right, now let's create a text field. So I'm going to say new text, put some numbers in there. Let's make these black, right aligned, and drop the size down a bit. All right, now we're going to just move this over here. We can move these all over just a bit. I'm going to make this value equal to the size of our bar graph. So if we open this up and find our text source, I can just pick whip from the text source to the X size in our shape layer. And then I'm going to have to open that up and just make sure I round this. If I type math.round, it's going to put in these 2 parentheses. Just make sure that last one, we'll just delete it and put it all the way at the end here. So now it'll round that number. Okay, good. Now, so I can just duplicate that layer, bring it down here, hit EE to open up the expression, and change this to bar 2 instead of bar 1. Okay, good. All right, so I've just added a couple more details to this to give it a little bit more character. Now, if we go back into our ring 1, we can just drop this title block in here and rotate it -90 degrees. Now, we can just go into our canvas tools and we're going to duplicate out a grid, which I think is going to be 4 by 1 with a gap of 2000. That looks about right. Now I can just grab all of those blocks. I'm just going to move them all the way to the left. So it's just going to cover up one whole block. Good. All right, let's take a look at that. All right, so we need to make some adjustments to our ring 1 here. We need to just scale this size down, the width down, to about 20 maybe. Okay. And add a motion tile. And we just bump this up to 250. That looks just about right. All right, let's go back into our ring, and just one more thing I want to do here. I'm going to grab these 2 noise layers, our bottom noise layers, and I'm just going to squash these down a little bit. Maybe and just move them down some. I want to make a little room up top because we're going to add a number here, as if each one of these is numbered. And I might push those over just a little bit too. Make sure they're centered in those blocks. Okay, so let's go to a new text layer. Type out 0, 0. And we'll rotate this -90. It's a little bit too large. And then I'm going to open up the source text and just make a quick expression on here, just index, so that we can duplicate this out, and it's just going to give us a unique number every time. So now if we go into our utilities and create a grid here, we're going to want 40 of these, and the gap is going to be 200. Just hit that button. Now we're going to grab all our text objects that we just created and just move them up here a little bit. And then the last thing we need to do is just go back in here. We'll just delete the ones that are on top of these title blocks. And then it will adjust our numbers. Since it's based on the index, I can just delete this, and then we'll have a gap here between 9 and 10. So go through and delete every one. And I think that's it. Yeah. Good. Okay, this is looking pretty good. Let's create another ring. New composition. We'll call this ring 2. And this one is going to be 4,000 by 500. Now our first ring is kind of vertically oriented. So the next one is going to be a little more horizontally oriented. So let's create a new solid. Call it noise 1. And we're going to make this 4,000 by 80. And we're going to add a turbulent noise. And make it block. And just turn the brightness down a little bit. And this one, we're going to open up the transform and set the height to 600. So we have these really tall, skinny blocks. And just like we did in our last ring, we're going to write an expression on the offset turbulence. But this time, we want to offset the other dimensions. So here again, value, open bracket 0, close bracket, comma, value 1. And then here on the x value, we're going to say plus times 200. All right, now this one's just going to move from left to right constantly. Now what I want to do is I want to create a bit of a jagged edge along one side. So I'm going to add another effect called wave warp. And we can change the pinning to bottom, so that the bottom edge won't change. And then we can just bump up this wave width quite a bit, so it's really large. And we'll take up the height a little bit until it starts to get those black spots showing up. We don't want those, so just dial it back down until they don't show up. All right, this is going to create a wave, and it's just going to automatically move from the left to the right, just the way our evolution is moving. But I want to make this pretty irregular instead of quite so regular like this sine curve. So what I'm going to do is just duplicate this wave warp and change these second parameters a little bit. Just make this wave a little bit bigger, and then maybe change the speed down a little bit. I'm going to do that again and make this one a lot smaller. And maybe we'll make this one faster, 1.2 seconds. So it's going to create an irregular shape. Now let's digitize this a little bit by sharpening it. We're going to add a mosaic effect. That's maybe 400 by 4. Make it sharp. And then again, we'll add a Venetian blinds to space these out a little bit. Just something like that's fine. All right, now let's add Colorama. So we can colorize this, and again, I'll go into the output cycle and change this red to black. I just like having a little bit of black in there. And you know, we can change these colors to whatever we want. I might add a little bit more blue in here, just to make these transitions a little sharper. Okay, good. So now what I'm going to do, I'm going to move this up here, and I want to create another copy. So I'm just going to duplicate this layer and move it down a little bit, and then just change the scale. So we make the Y scale -100. So it's just going to be a mirror copy of what we have above it. And then maybe I'll go into the turbulent noise and change the random seed. So it's just a little bit different, but still follows the same basic pattern. All right, now let's create a little bit of a border around these. I'm just going to double click on a rectangle tool and turn off the solid and make this just a stroke. And we'll make it a bit skinnier so we can just move this up right in between our two lines here and dial in the size to what we want it to be. Okay, so this is a good start. Again, we want to add a little bit of structure. I'm going to create a new composition and call this divider and make it 1000 by 200. And I'm just going to create some lines here to give us a little bit more shape. So let's create another box here, and I might make it just a bit skinnier and then drop it down. So it's just going to get cut off at the bottom. Let's do that again. And I might make this one white. And this one, I kind of keep this blue color. And then this one I'm going to widen out a little bit. Just move this up. I really just want this one line. And if we open up the shape settings and right click on the rectangle path, we can convert to Bezier. And then just turn on our grid. We'll just add a couple points. I'm going to do one there and one maybe halfway in between these two. Same thing on this side. All right, then I can grab these two and push them up a little bit. And then maybe I'll just hold shift and select this point, hold shift and hit the left key 4 times. Over here, right key 4 times. Maybe a little bit more than that so they're equal. And then this I might just scale down a little bit in the width so that it kind of matches up with this point right there. Touch more. All right, we'll go back into our ring 2 and we're just going to bring that divider comp out, and we're going to grid this out 4 by 1 grid and make it 1000 pixel gap. Okay, grab those and just move them down to the bottom. All right, now I'm going to create a text layer. And in this, I'm just going to write section 01. And center that. And then I'm going to grid that as well. Duplicate that grid. We can grab these and bring them down. And then, of course, we'll just change the numbers on each of these to section 2, section 3, and 4. All right, let's add this to our radial composition. So ring 2 is going to go in here. I'm going to bring it down some and squeeze the width down till it's just about right. And then add our motion tile. Now I want this one to match up really well, so I'm just going to zoom in the top here, play around with the scale until I get it just right. So it's going to be more than 26, but less than 27. 26.6. Okay, this is going to be completely good enough for me. Okay, looking good. I think I just want to add one more thing to this ring too. So let's just create another solid, and we'll make this 50 by 200 and call it noise. Yeah, it's a little too skinny. Let's make this 100 by 200 and put a turbulent noise on this one. Make it block. We're going to squash down the scale. The width is going to be really high, and I'm going to take this up to 1,000. 1,000. Something like that. We'll drop down the brightness, increase the contrast. Maybe I set this, instead of basic, to subscale. You know, get a little more activity in here. Then we can go into our sub settings and play around with these settings. Oh, kind of like that. All right, let's set an evolution expression. This one I might posterize to 3 times time times 300. And then, of course, colorama. I'm just going to go into our noise layer and copy this from here and paste it onto this noise. All right, and then I'm going to double click on the rectangle tool while this is selected to create a new mask, and then I'll just add one more effect, stroke, so we can make this have a bit of an outline. Okay, now I want to duplicate out a grid of this. This time we want 5 by 1 with 1,000 pixels gap, and then we can grab all of these and just drop them down. One thing I forgot to do though is I don't want them to be the same, so I'm going to undo that. Let's go into our evolution and just make sure we put an expression on the random seed. Put an expression on here that's just index, so that each one will have a unique random seed. Now duplicate it again and bring them down to here. All right, let's take a look. All right, so I think this is looking pretty good. I just want to create a couple more rings to fill out this display, and then we'll add just a bit of spit and polish to wrap it up. All right, so I've created a few more rings to fill this out. Ring 3 just looks like this. It's got a bunch of little details and little bits of charts, and it's just repeated a lot of times. And then ring 4 is just kind of this line graph. You can follow my previous tutorial if you want to learn how to make this. And then I also created this center graphic. Instead of trying to create a ring that's really tight in here, that's going to get really distorted. So instead, I'm just going to create this whole other composition. And I'll just grab this and put it in here above my adjustment layer. Right, it's just got a bunch of details in here that are sort of animated numbers and you know, just some kind of techie looking things. Now one more thing I want to do in here is in the center I want to make something kind of special. So I'm going to create a new solid, call this center noise 1, and make it 1200 by 1200. Then we'll just add a quick turbulent noise, turn up the contrast, turn down the brightness a little bit. I'm going to change the width and height so that's kind of a tall thing. Let's make it like really tall. All right, let's put some evolution on that. And then on this layer by itself, I'm going to add the polar coordinates effect. Change this to rect to polar and make it 100. And then let's add a ball action to sort of gridify this and you know, kind of take down the size of these dots a little bit. Let me just Make this a little bit smaller so it's not quite on the edge of that. And then I think I want to play with the sub settings. Maybe I'll change this to block and change this to subscale. Crank up the sub influence. Maybe take this size down a little bit. And actually I think here's a good time when we don't want to evolve this. Instead we're going to want to move the offset turbulence. So let's write an expression here. Let me just solo this and turn off these other things. Same thing we've done before. Value 0, value 1. And then I think we want to add this on the Y. Let's see what that does. All right, now let's duplicate that. And here I want to bring up the contrast and bring the brightness way down so that just get a few of these things. And then we'll add a colorama to this second one. And again, in our output phase, make this black. Now, I'm going to make sure we change the blend mode to screen. I might drop this one down in opacity just some. Something like that maybe, so there's just kind of constant particles flowing out from the center. Maybe we'll adjust these up a little bit to get a little bit more color in this top area. Yeah, that's better. And then I'm just going to add one more circle right in the middle here that has a solid black center. All right, here we are in our final composition, 1920 by 1080. I've brought in my Radial comp, made it 3D, and then just done a subtle camera animation with the aperture cranked up so we get some depth of field effects. For our last bit of animation, I'm going to go back into my Radial comp here. I want to add a little bit of rotation to each of these rings. Now we know because of the polar coordinates effect that we're using that it's really easy to do this. Let me just solo these things by just moving our compositions left and right. But of course that's going to cause a problem when we get to the end and we start to have this gap because it's being pushed off the side of the composition. Luckily we have a very easy solution. Because we're already using the motion tile, we can animate this tile center. So I'm just going to Option or Alt click on this tile center and create another expression just like before. In this case we want it to move left to right, so we're going to be modifying the X value, and we can just put plus time times 100. And then I'm going to copy this expression and I'm going to go into each of my subsequent rings here. Let's see, so the next ring is ring 1, and on this tile center let's make an expression, and we'll maybe make this a little bit slower, and it's going to be negative 80, so it goes the opposite direction. Ring 2, maybe make this one a little faster, and it's going to go left to right. And then our innermost ring, we'll make this one again negative, but maybe just make it negative 50. All right, now all our rings are rotating around the center at different speeds. All right, finally, this is looking okay, but I want to play with the color just a little bit. So I'm going to just create an adjustment layer in here and add a hue and saturation effect. And I'm just going to play with this master hue value, just pushing it a little bit to see if I like a different color combination better. And I find that I kind of like this pinkish purple thing. So I'm going to keep it right around there. And then let's add some glow. And I'm going to duplicate out a couple copies of this, adjusting the radius and then playing with the intensity and the threshold just to make it look just right. And then just one more little thing I want to do. I'm going to duplicate out a couple of copies of this and just pull this forward in space a little bit. And give me one more and drop this behind. And I'll take these 2 extra copies. Let's put this one down here and drop the opacity down quite a bit. It just gives it a little bit of depth. All right, so that is just about it for this one. Hope you've enjoyed, and I'll see you next time.